Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. Today I'm going to talk about how to use telling instead of showing to enhance your novel. Now I know you're all scared that I'm about to be smited by the gods of writing, but there are situations where it does not make sense to try to use showing, and telling is a better option. Of course, if you can show something, it is almost always the better option. You shouldn't rely on telling just because it's easier or simpler, because showing really will improve engagement. But there are some things it just doesn't make sense to try to show to your reader. For example, if there was a famine caused by mutant mealworms 40 years ago and the economy is still recovering, how are you going to show that to the readers? You can show that the fields are all chewed up, or you can show that people are really struggling financially, but that doesn't really explain why it happened, why people are in this situation. You could have your character watch an educational film about the Great Mealworm Famine, but at that point you're really just telling in a different way. The general rule that I recommend following is if you would need to add a scene and it would be fairly contrived or irrelevant other than that it would show a piece of information, it's probably okay to just go ahead and tell that information. That's probably the easier choice. So once you're certain that you need to tell a piece of information, I have a step-by-step process that you can use to do that in the best possible way so that you don't bore the reader, or really so the reader won't even notice that you're telling at all. Of course, as you get better at this, you don't really need to go through the steps every time. It will become second nature. It'll become a lot easier as you get more practice at it. Step number 1 is to determine why you're including the information in the first place. Is it important to the plot? Is it vital for the reader to know this piece of information so that things make sense later on? Or is it just to enhance the mood or the atmosphere of the story? Or is it just included as a fun bit of fantasy or sci-fi or creativity just to make the reading experience more engaging? If you're including something just for fun, make sure that it's actually fun to read about. Something like tax exemptions for ninja warriors or the complete anatomy of a creature that's only described on one page is not going to be very engaging for the reader. Step number 2 is to figure out if you need the fact or the story. One of the biggest mistakes that can lead to information overload is when instead of providing a relevant fact, you provide the entire story behind the fact. So for example, do readers need to know that a face-melting laser beam exists, the fact, or do they need to know who invented it and why, the story behind it? If you include the story when all you really need is the fact, your writing is going to get really bloated and overwhelming, and readers are probably going to get bored. An example of a situation where you might need the story behind something is if orcs won't use the face-melting laser beam because it was invented by warlocks and orcs hate warlocks, then the story behind it is relevant. If the reader just needs to know that this face-melting laser beam exists, then all you need to do is state the fact. You do not need to explain the entire story behind it, how it was invented, where it came from, etc. Step 3 is assessing what is the bare minimum that the reader needs to know. What is the smallest amount of information you can provide so that the reader still gets the same effect, so they still understand what you're explaining, or if it's intended to set the mood or the atmosphere, that they still get that sense of mood and atmosphere. What is the bare minimum? Most of the time you don't want to go on and on conveying a lot of details because readers will get bored. So figure out the bare minimum that you need to explain that, and move on. Step 4 is assessing what the reader needs to know right now. Readers may need to know the information eventually, but they might not need to know it at this point. But at the same time, you don't want to introduce things out of the blue way late in the story. For example, if holograms exist in your world, you don't want to introduce that for the first time 60% into the story. It should be mentioned early on. But breaking up the information and conveying what the reader needs to know at various points can help you to not get stuck explaining long stretches of telling, and can help you to move on more quickly. For example, if in your story it's important that readers understand that holograms exist, you could show a hologram in the background of a scene, maybe in an advertisement or something that isn't very substantial or prominent, and that just gets it into the reader's head that holograms exist, and that helps your world building, which you want to establish early on. But readers probably don't need to understand more details than that to understand the first quarter of the story. So then as time moves on, in the second quarter or in the third quarter, you might then introduce more specific details. So maybe later on you explain who the creator of the hologram was or how a hologram works in detail, assuming that information is relevant to your story in some way. And that helps you to separate that information so that at the beginning of the story, in the early parts, you're not getting bogged down in explaining things, because you don't want a whole bunch of explanations at the beginning of the story. That can make the reader disengage, and it can be hard to get the kind of hook that you want. Step number 5 is integrate it into action. The main reason that telling tends to be a problem is because it feels like the writer has just hit the pause button and starts going on and on about information just that they think that you need to know. And that's not very engaging because it doesn't have any relevance to the current scene. There's no connection. And so the reader doesn't really have any reason to care. And that disconnection, that's what causes telling to be an issue. So when you incorporate the telling into the active scene, somehow when you attach it to the action, it becomes a lot more interesting and engaging, and the reader probably won't even notice that you're telling at all. For example, if you need to introduce the specific ingredients of a potion, you could have your character go into a potion shop as part of a scene that advances the plot, and maybe he accidentally knocks over a sleeping potion. And in the narration or in his thoughts, you can convey, wow, the shopkeeper must be frustrated because dragon heart is the main ingredient in that potion and it's really hard to come by. All of a sudden, you've told something to the reader and the reader doesn't even really notice because it's part of the scene. It feels wrapped up in what's going on. This idea still works even if you need to tell something a bit longer where the story rather than the fact is important. For example, maybe you need to explain that several people died of an overdose from this potion. You can explain that in the same way. So your protagonist could go accidentally knock the potion over, sort of recoil from it out of fear, and then in the narration or even in the dialogue, you could explain he doesn't want anything to do with this potion because last year a few people died from taking too much. Connecting the information to something occurring in the current scene is a great way to hide the fact that you're telling something to the reader. Most readers will never notice that you're telling something, and your writing will feel very smooth and natural. If you do it well, especially if you take a layered approach where you introduce things and then develop on what the reader knows over time, and if you connect that information to something happening in an active scene, you can get away with quite a bit of telling and still have a perfectly smooth, nice, easy to read story. I really hope the tips in this video helped you to understand how you can tell more effectively and how telling can help you to enhance your story. If you have any questions, please put it in the comments. This video has been part of my novel bootcamp series. I'll be making a new video 3 to 4 days per week throughout August. I'll also be hosting free workshops on my blog, so if you want to come check that out, I'll put the link in the description. Happy writing, guys!